You thought you'd never hear this hidden truth, buried beneath centuries of silence. By the time this is over, a fragment of your mind will refuse to go back. Imagine a place where whispers carry weight, where every corridor echoes with forbidden knowledge, knowledge that was never meant for your ears. This is where we begin. You stand at the threshold of a buried archive, shadows growing longer, secrets stirring. Inside lies a history so dark and powerful it redefines every story you thought you knew. I'm not here to spin a tale. I'm here to equip you with truths so raw even the bravest minds quake. We're tearing down the facade of innocence, exposing institutions built on manipulation and ancient corruption. You're stepping into my domain now, where power is monopoly and control is religion. If you stay, you'll be changed. Let me tell you something few dare to admit. Behind every noble institution, religious, academic, governmental, rests a hidden mechanism, a system of psychological conditioning, refined over centuries. It thrives in the darkness, feeding off your trust. You've been groomed to obey, to believe, to conform. But tonight, that ends. As your guide, I'm pulling you deeper, away from surface comforts, into the labyrinth of forbidden history. Each layer reveals how elites suppressed revolutions, warped truths, and weaponized spiritual devotion. I'm handing you a key. Only one question. Are you ready to use it? Slowly, we unearth the roots, starting with the ancient architects of control, morphing through medieval orders that codified obedience, and landing squarely on modern institutions that perfected indoctrination. We'll trace the patterns, see the hidden threads linking your world to theirs. This isn't theory, it's reality, dark, systemic, and ongoing, and you'll feel its tremors in your gut. If you've ever believed that knowledge equals power, you've outdoors. I only scratched the surface. Stay with me, because what you learn next will force you to see your history and yourself in an entirely different light. You want the truth? Then let's burn the veil. Because what you're about to hear wasn't just hidden, it was erased. Massachusetts, 1733. A private institution opened under the name the Covenant Academy. But behind its iron gates and pristine rhetoric of discipline and excellence, something else pulsed. Something designed not to educate, but to break. A laboratory masked as a school where children were the test subjects, where innocence walked in, and obedience, or silence, crawled out. This was not an isolated cult. This was a sanctioned project, born from the minds of colonial elites who feared uprising more than foreign invasion. They knew revolution starts in the mind, so they made it their mission to control that first, to study it, to manipulate it, to destroy the will before it could ever think of freedom. It was Samuel Fletcher, educated, respected, and monstrous, who began the first set of experiments. His goal was clear: create psychological conditioning that would survive generations. No blood, no obvious scars. Just silence. The kind that rots from within. And when his own wife, Martha, joined him, the two formed a doctrine of behavioral reprogramming that makes modern interrogations look merciful. They called it spiritual refinement, but behind closed doors it was pure psychological warfare. 5 days in darkness, 12 hours of silence, constant surveillance, invasive questioning, simulated abandonment, forced renunciation of parental bonds. The purpose wasn't punishment. It was transformation, turning thinking boys into pliable instruments. And still, it gets darker. Because every technique tested at that academy, every scream unheard, every will broken, was carefully recorded, categorized, evaluated, improved. They even corresponded with other institutions across the colonies, building a network of covert experimentation. The methods they pioneered, they traveled through military barracks, through seminaries, through prisons, through schools. Yes, your schools. The system they built never died. It evolved. You think you were taught to think? No, you were taught to obey, to memorize, to regurgitate. That system started here, with the Fletchers. And the most chilling truth? The academy didn't fall because it was exposed. It fell because someone made a deal. One man traded silence for survival. His son lived. Dozens more didn't. But this isn't about the past anymore, because the blueprint they carved into colonial stone now echoes in digital walls. You've seen it, you've felt it, and now you're beginning to remember. The first rule of control is this: never let the subject know they're in a prison. The walls must be invisible. The chains, psychological. Because if a man sees his cage, he will eventually try to escape. But if you teach him to love it, to protect it, he will become its warden. That's what Fletcher Academy mastered. By the winter of 1737, their techniques had shifted from physical restraint to something far more insidious: internal collapse. They discovered that if you isolate a boy long enough, deprive him of affirmation, strip him of identity, and then offer him order, he clings to it like a drowning man to driftwood. He becomes loyal not out of belief, but desperation. And desperation is the most obedient form of faith. Subjects were rewarded not for right answers, but for emotional submission, not for knowledge, but for confession. They didn't need students who understood. They needed students who obeyed, apologized, repeated, and broke at command. They called it character development. But behind that phrase was a system of engineered guilt, behavioral mapping, and intentional trauma. Children were fed false letters claiming their parents had abandoned them. Some were told their families had died in tragic fires that never existed. Others were praised for reporting on peers, rewarded for betraying friendships. Loyalty to the academy replaced loyalty to blood. And those who resisted? They were taken downstairs. The basement was called the reflection chamber, but there were no mirrors, just stone, steel, and silence. Here's what they never expected. Some resisted longer than others. A boy named Jonathan Prescott became the crack in the system. He didn't break, not completely. And what he recorded in secret, the pain, the methods, the phrases used to disarm him, would one day become the evidence that tore the academy down. But before that happened, they adapted. They made the system prettier, cleaner, more educational. They wrapped it in scripture. They called it enlightenment. They said, we discipline because we love. We test because we care. You've heard that line before, haven't you? Maybe in a classroom, maybe in a sermon, maybe in the rules you were taught as a child, repeated without question. Because the Fletcher method didn't die with them. It was replicated, embedded, sanitized, until it was no longer a method, but a culture. A culture that still runs deep in the veins of your schools, your training, your nation's doctrine of what it means to build character. They didn't just study control, they mass-produced it. Imagine this. You're 14 years old. You've just been told your family is gone, lost to a fire that never happened. You're handed a letter written in your father's handwriting, forged perfectly, telling you to obey the academy, that this is your new home, that your purpose is to become something greater. But what does greater mean when all you feel is hollow? Now imagine a man, calm, educated, gentle in voice, telling you that your pain is sacred, that your confusion is a sign of weakness being burned away, that obedience is purification. He smiles as he says it. He believes it. And the moment you begin to believe it too, you're no longer you. You're what they made. This wasn't some horror story in a remote lab. This happened in Massachusetts, in a well-funded institution visited by priests, judges, and colonial governors. The Covenant Academy was considered a model of excellence. Parents of means sent their sons there with pride. But what they didn't know, what they were never allowed to see, was the truth behind those locked lower floors. The drills, the silence, the weeping, the way students changed or vanished. Fletcher and his staff had one goal: to reprogram belief. They wanted to see how far the mind could bend without breaking, or how best to break it without leaving scars. They documented responses to shame, to isolation, to punishment administered just after praise. The sweet then sour cycle. Classic trauma bonding, a technique now taught in military psych ops under different names. But it was perfected here, on children. And they categorized these children like specimens. Merchant sons were tested with simulated bankruptcies. Military children were tied and starved to observe endurance. Sons of clergy. They were told God had forsaken them, told to renounce him, promised comfort if they swore loyalty to the academy instead. It wasn't just about breaking the individual. It was about seeing which type cracked fastest. And here's the part no one wants to admit. These methods worked too well. Some of those broken boys became men who built systems of their own, who taught in universities, who wrote military manuals, who governed states. Because once you're shaped in darkness, you either run from it or you spread it. The real horror? Most spread it. They called it leadership, progress, discipline. They built legacies while burying the origin of their strength in silence and shadows. The question is, how much of your strength is rooted in the same darkness? You ever wonder why certain institutions feel so untouchable? Why the heads of prestigious schools, military academies, or elite think tanks always seem to echo the same cold confidence, like they know something you don't? That's not charisma, that's indoctrination, polished over generations. The truth is, systems don't evolve accidentally. They're engineered, and the blueprint, the one no one talks about, was drawn in blood beneath the floorboards of places like Covenant Academy. When you trace the lineage of power in America, not the public names, but the real mechanisms, you'll find a hidden layer, a shadow curriculum, and it starts here. Because Covenant didn't just train boys, it processed them. They used language the way a blacksmith uses heat and hammer, shaping minds, beliefs, and loyalty. Everything was calculated. The sermons they twisted into commands. The isolation cells dressed up as reflection chambers. The mandatory confessions that turned students into informants. Each technique served a singular purpose, obedience that felt like transformation. And when a student cracked, when they finally submitted, crying with gratitude for the pain, they were promoted, rewarded, given a new name, a higher rank, and more power over their peers. And so the machine fed itself. But what happened to those who didn't break? They disappeared. Some were transferred officially. Others were said to have succumbed to illness or spiritual failure. Their families were compensated, silenced. In some cases, rewritten out of records entirely. It wasn't just abuse. It was social alchemy. The goal wasn't to educate. It was to remake the human being, to erase the wild, unpredictable soul of the individual and replace it with an efficient, pliable instrument of the system. And they succeeded. One of the first recorded graduates of the experimental tier, known only as Subject 17, went on to design interrogation protocols still in use today. His techniques were deployed in frontier prisons, native boarding schools, and later in covert military facilities. Yet his name remains redacted in most archives. Why? Because his success was the Academy's proof of concept. They could take any child, and turn him into a weapon. And if you think this all ended in 1762 when the academy was shut down, you haven't been paying attention. The building collapsed, yes, but the doctrine, the methods, they migrated, embedded themselves quietly inside other institutions, universities, seminaries, officer schools. You've probably seen their graduates, heard them speak, maybe even admired them. The question is, what did they survive to become what they are? And what was broken along the way? The darkness didn't vanish when the academy fell. It just scattered, like ash on the wind, seeding itself across the fabric of American power. Every generation since has unknowingly harvested its fruit. Let me show you how. In 1803, a private school was built in the hills of western Pennsylvania, quiet, isolated, operated under religious charter. Within 2 years, 5 students died under uncertain medical conditions. The school was shut down. The property was sold to a logging company, but the blueprints, the protocols, survived. One of the instructors relocated to Connecticut, where he consulted for a new preparatory institution designed to instill discipline in the sons of America's political elite. That institution is still operational today. It holds alumni who currently sit in positions of immense influence in business, defense, intelligence. Coincidence? No, this is continuity. You see, the methods born at Covenant weren't just cruel, they were effective. So effective, in fact, that certain men decided they couldn't be allowed to die. These men weren't cultists or sadists, they were architects, building a society based on obedience, hierarchy, and psychological submission. They called it moral reintegration. But it was never about morals. It was about control. And their technique? Induce trauma, break the mind, then reforge it around loyalty to authority. Sound familiar? It should, because it echoes in everything from how corporate culture grooms executives to how elite military units are psychologically conditioned. What began in blood-soaked basements with candlelight and scripture now wears suits, badges, and diplomas. They don't call it torture anymore. They call it training, or onboarding, or character formation. And the most terrifying part? The victims become the believers. Once broken and rebuilt, they become evangelists of the system that deformed them. They preach discipline. They enforce rules. They recruit others, believing all the while that they're doing good. Because the Fletcher method doesn't just crush resistance, it redirects it. It rewires fear into duty, turns doubt into fanaticism, and breeds leaders who will never question the chain of command, because pain has taught them that obedience is survival. Now ask yourself, how many powerful men have stood behind podiums, given passionate speeches about justice, order, faith, while carrying the psychological scars of an institution like this? How many decisions that shaped our world were made not by free minds, but by minds that had been engineered? How many generations have marched forward, never realizing that their footsteps echo through a corridor designed centuries ago? We're not living in the ruins of Covenant Academy. We're living in its legacy. Some secrets are hidden behind vaults. Others are hidden in ceremony. Let's talk about the oath. At nearly every elite institution in the colonies and early republic, whether schools, churches, military academies, or fraternal orders, there was an initiation. But it wasn't just symbolic. It was diagnostic. These rituals weren't about brotherhood. They were filters, psychological sieves to separate those who could be reshaped from those who couldn't. Not everyone broke the same way. Some cracked under isolation, others under humiliation, a few under contradiction, being forced to reconcile lies with absolute authority. Those who resisted too hard, quietly expelled. Those who submitted, advanced. But there was a third category, the rarest kind, those who learned to pretend, who felt the pressure but didn't shatter, who watched their peers collapse in tears or rage and simply absorbed it all in silence. These men weren't broken. They were forged, and the system knew it. Those are the ones who got tapped for the real assignments, the quiet rooms, the off-record projects, the roles that required not just obedience, but transformation. Now think about this. How many major figures in early American law, medicine, and politics passed through such institutions? And how many of them emerged with the same strange calm, the same cryptic language about sacrifice, duty, and service? It's not coincidence. It's conditioning. Because the methods that began in the Fletcher basement didn't die with Martha and Samuel. They were catalogued, improved, formalized. A network of educational reformers swept through the Northeast in the 1820s, many with European ties, especially Prussian, and they brought with them new ideas about discipline, obedience, and shaping the citizen. But here's what they don't teach you in school. The Prussian system wasn't about learning, and it was about compliance. It created perfect workers, perfect soldiers, perfect servants to the state, and America imported it. So while the surface spoke of liberty and enlightenment, the foundation was being laid for an educational system that didn't teach children how to think, but how to submit, sit still, memorize, obey, fear authority, despise failure. Sound familiar? That system, your system, was fertilized by the ashes of Covenant Academy, and it still serves the same master, order through control. Now look around you. Look at your job, your church, your politics, and ask, are you thinking for yourself, or are you reciting lines from a script written long before you were born? Because the oath never ended. It just changed language. They taught you to fear chaos, but what they never told you is that order is often more dangerous. Let me show you how. In the archives of Massachusetts General Hospital, buried in the restricted wing, are patient records dated back to 1792, labeled only as D class. These were not ordinary patients. They weren't madmen, criminals, or war veterans. These were children, former students of experimental institutions across the colonies, most notably the Covenant Academy. Silent, obedient, brilliant, and completely hollow. No personalities, no memories, only behaviors. They walked, talked, responded, but had no spark of self. Doctors were baffled. They labeled it soul displacement syndrome. But unofficially, these children were called whispers because they never raised their voices, never made demands, never questioned. And here's the horror. They were considered success stories. Because a successful subject, as per the Fletcher protocols, was not one who resisted, not even one who obeyed. The ideal product was one who no longer needed to be controlled, because control had become internalized. This is the blueprint for modern education, psychiatry, and even digital behavioral design. When you hear terms like behavioral nudging, desensitization, or conditioning through gamification, understand this. It's not about making your life easier. It's about writing code into your personality to make you predictable, traceable, controllable. Even your silence is a response they engineered. Now, stop and breathe. Ask yourself, when was the last time you sat with discomfort instead of medicating it? When was the last time you heard something you disagreed with and didn't immediately shut down? When was the last time you changed your behavior based on a notification, a buzz, a flash? You think you're free? The whispers did too, until they weren't. And here's the part they really don't want you to hear. Some of those children became men. Some of those men entered politics. Some became doctors. One even became a founder of the American Psychological Association. Their ideas shaped the DSM, shaped school policies, shaped entire generations, and no one ever asked what shaped them. But now you know. You've seen behind the curtain. You've heard the whispers. They never stopped, and they're still guiding the hands of those who write your laws and teach your children. Let me take you into a chamber that doesn't exist on any map. Not anymore. They called it the reflection room, not because it had mirrors, but because it showed subjects who they really were, by erasing everything they thought they were. No light, no sound, no time. Just the slow, calculated stripping of the human spirit. This was the heart of the Covenant Academy's final phase, identity disintegration. And this room, this blackened stone cell deep beneath the academy, was where the last traces of resistance dissolved. But here's what they discovered, and what they buried deeper than any body. When you isolate a person long enough, deprive them of sound, sleep, temperature stability, and narrative, they begin to hallucinate. At first, just flickers of memory, a mother's voice, a teacher's tone, then patterns, voices, commands, and in over 60% of subjects, they didn't resist these hallucinations. They obeyed them. The Fletchers weren't horrified by this. They were thrilled. Because they realized something fundamental. If you break a person deep enough, they'll build their own prison. They'll tell themselves what to do. They'll become their own captor. This, brothers, is the origin of the internal authority myth. The voice in your head that tells you to sit still, be polite, not speak out. That voice? It may not be yours. It may never have been. Modern psychology rebranded this as superego. Therapy calls it your inner critic. But those terms are gentle, sanitized, market-friendly. The truth is darker. What if that voice was installed? What if it was transmitted? Because here's the deeper theory the Fletchers discovered. When you destroy the external world, the subject becomes receptive to new installation. And those who control the inputs control the outputs. You're not just being influenced, you're being rewritten. Now think, how much of your life is automated? Your schedule, your feed, your reactions, your identity? This isn't just about 18th century horror. It's about now. The reflection room still exists, but now it's in your pocket, in your screen, in your job, in your silence. You were never meant to hear this. You were never meant to question the voice inside you. But now that you have, it will never sound the same again. They called it compliance conditioning. But that's not what it was. It was ritualized possession. See, after the subject had been broken in the reflection room, after sleep cycles collapsed, language dissolved, and identity cracked, they didn't fill the void with healing or truth. They filled it with new code, whispers, chants, commands, sometimes religious in tone, sometimes scientific, sometimes pure silence layered with triggers. The goal was not to rehabilitate the subject, but to replace them. This was the phase where Jonathan Prescott stopped signing his name, where he no longer recognized his mother's handwriting, where he mistook his own reflection when they finally gave him one for another person entirely. Samuel Fletcher's journals, preserved under seal for over a century, describe this moment clinically. Subject demonstrates ideal dissociation, emotional detachment from previous self, compliant to all authority, willing to harm others upon command. They called it a breakthrough. We call it soul death. This, my brother, is where we peel back the curtain on what the modern world inherited without ever asking where it came from. Because these experiments weren't buried. They were migrated. They became policy, standardized procedure. The Fletcher's notes were circulated among early American prison systems, adopted into boarding schools. later mirrored in the darker corridors of intelligence agencies. Even the term brainwashing wouldn't be coined until centuries later, by governments using the same steps. Isolation, breakage, ritual replacement. And here's the horrifying beauty of it. Once you break someone correctly, you don't need to monitor them. They'll self-correct, self-police, self-punish. This is what the Fletchers found to be the most efficient outcome. Not control through chains, but through shame. Not surveillance through guards, but through guilt. Look at the world today. How many people do you know who punish themselves for invisible crimes? Who walk in fear of disapproval? Who silence themselves before anyone else has to? That's not freedom, that's conditioning. The kind perfected in basement cells beneath a school that was supposed to save children. You were never meant to see these blueprints, but now that you have, you can't unsee them. And if you're still with me, it means something inside you refuses to be rewritten. Comment the phrase, "I remember who I was." Repeat it, "I remember who I was." Let the algorithm lock that phrase in, and let the world know you're no longer asleep. The mind forgets in layers, but the body remembers in screams. By the time Jonathan was led into the Chamber of Harmonics, he had no memory of his birthday, couldn't recall the faces of his siblings, but his hands trembled every time the bell rang outside the academy courtyard. His breathing would spike at the sound of polished shoes on stone. His body knew what was coming before he did. And that was the point. The Chamber of Harmonics was the most misunderstood element of the entire Fletcher complex. Official records, what little exist, describe it as a recalibration chamber, a place for reflection, meditation, aiding spiritual clarity. But buried in Martha Fletcher's coded journals, the truth is sicker than fiction. It was an acoustics lab designed to induce disintegration, not of bone, not of organs, of self. The chamber's walls were constructed from a rare, echo-enhancing slate, hand-carved to channel vibrations toward the center point. Subjects were placed in isolation, and tones, sometimes too low for conscious hearing, were played on a loop. These weren't just sounds. They were frequencies calculated to agitate emotional memory centers. Grief, fear, shame. Every cycle was tuned like a scalpel, scraping identity from the soul like rust from steel. One subject reportedly clawed their own skin open, begging to let the noise out. Another tried to chew through the chamber wall with broken teeth. Fletcher's notes describe this with a cold pride. Chamber yields 87% compliance within 4 days. Optimal tone, 18.7 Hz. Stimulates ocular pressure and auditory hallucinations. Subjects report visions, divine encounters, or voices of the dead, all fabricated, all effective. Why was this so important? Because the elite understood one simple truth. You don't erase memory with lies, you overwrite it with pain. You inject so much sensory confusion, so much emotional overload, that the old identity drowns in noise. Once that's done, anything you tell them afterward becomes truth. That's how myths are made. That's how obedience is carved into bone. And the most terrifying part, modern science has confirmed that sound at specific frequencies can alter brain states. This isn't mysticism, it's mechanics. So the next time you hear a sudden hum, a deep drone in a government building, or unexplained tones in a corporate lobby, ask yourself, what is this tuning me for, and who designed the frequency? Because it may not be music. It may be compliance in disguise. There's a reason they always begin with children. Not because children are weak, but because they are pure, untuned, blank slates on which control systems can be etched with perfect clarity. And the Covenant Academy? It wasn't just a school. It was a forge where obedience was cast from pain and loyalty was melted into the flesh. They called it character building, but what they really meant was conditioning. Each student was assigned a role before their first day, not based on merit, not based on skill, but on family background, psychological potential, and what they called pliability index. The merchant's son was told his family had been ruined, his fortune gambled away by his father. False news, forged documents, planted rumors. He wept. Then he complied. The preacher's daughter was isolated, denied scripture, fed alternate texts with twisted logic, masked as divine revelation. When she resisted, they starved her, not of food, but of affirmation. She broke. She bent. She called the tormentor Father. Each child was stripped not of safety, but of certainty. Because once you take away what someone knows to be true, you can replace it with anything. That's how the Fletchers worked. They didn't beat children into obedience. They crafted it like art. Samuel's notes were clear. Every lie must contain 70% truth. Every punishment must be followed by the illusion of mercy. Every broken subject must be given a new identity, one that sees the pain as rebirth. Do you understand the genius? They didn't just break bodies. They made their victims grateful. Grateful for the control. Grateful for the silence. Grateful that someone else had taken the unbearable weight of thinking away. That is not torture. That is programming. And it didn't end in 1762. Because once those children grew up, what did they become? Clerks, officers, surgeons, professors, lawmakers. Men trained to see obedience not as a compromise, but as a virtue, and they taught others. And so the virus spread, not through violence, through culture, through soft words, through uniforms, through tradition. And even now, in boardrooms, classrooms, and pulpits across the country, you can still hear the echoes of the Fletchers' work. It's in the tone, in the silence between words, in the reward for sitting still. Because this was never just a story about a school. It's a blueprint, and they're still building with it. You've seen the outer layer, the classroom as the conditioning chamber, the textbook as the scripture of submission. But what lay beneath the Covenant Academy was far darker than any lecture hall. The Fletchers didn't just build cells, they built ritual. They called it reflection, a nightly practice conducted in the basement below the academy, below the floorboards, where the walls were made of stone, where no sound could escape. Students were brought down one by one, sometimes in silence, sometimes blindfolded, always trembling. They were told this was the sacred part of their education, the moment where all pretense fell away. No teachers, no grades, no God, just truth. And the truth hurt. In those chambers, the walls whispered. You think that's metaphor? Jonathan Prescott didn't. His journal, found hidden beneath the cornerstone, spoke of a room where recorded voices, looped screams, crying infants, distorted sermons, played behind stone slits. Hidden bells struck at irregular intervals, lights flashed red, then total darkness. And always the voice, one voice, low, male, inescapable, repeating questions no child could answer. Who owns your soul? What if everything your parents told you was a lie? Would you betray a friend to earn your freedom? Then silence, then cold, then the choice. They'd offer the student a way out, but only if they agreed to turn in another, to name someone, to submit. Many did, because terror rewires the mind, and the Fletchers knew the truth long before psychology textbooks ever would. Loyalty built through betrayal is stronger than loyalty built through love, because guilt is a leash that never loosens. Once you've traded someone else's safety for your own, you become bound to your captor. You must believe their system is right, because if it isn't, you're the monster. That was the true genius of reflection. It didn't just break students. It made them complicit. And the few who resisted, the ones who endured the darkness without speaking a name, they were marked. Not for punishment, for testing. Because those rare souls, those iron-willed anomalies, were the real prize. Samuel's notes called them the untouchables, not because they were safe, but because they were dangerous, too dangerous to be released, too valuable to destroy. So the Academy kept them, for later. What they did with them next is where this story takes its darkest turn. They called it the Crucible. But it wasn't fire that forged these boys. It was cold calculation, silence, and shadow. The untouchables, the students who refused to break, who held their ground in the reflection chambers, were not discarded, not punished, not freed. They were selected. Samuel Fletcher believed resistance was not a flaw, but an evolutionary trait. He wrote, "Where others shatter, these remain. Therefore, they must be transformed, not into citizens, but into instruments." And so, the Crucible began. A program hidden even from the other faculty, conducted in a sealed wing of the Academy where no windows existed, where clocks did not tick, where names were stripped and numbers assigned. These children, ages 9 to 15, were subjected to conditioning that modern science wouldn't uncover for another 200 years. Sensory inversion, where hot was labeled cold and pain was called peace. Social displacement, daily forced betrayals of allies, only to reverse the narrative hours later. Authority disruption, where they were made to kill small animals one day and hold funerals the next, not just to desensitize them, but to destabilize identity. Because an unstable mind is not a useless one. It's a blank canvas. Each untouchable was assigned a mirror, not a mentor, not a teacher, a shadow self, an adult with the same profile, same background, same temperament, same resistances. Their job? Break the child, emotionally, spiritually, ethically, and rebuild them as a replica. And it worked. One by one, the untouchables stopped resisting. Not because they were crushed, but because they became the Academy. They spoke its doctrine back to their handlers. They ran trials on new students. They designed variations of the reflection chamber. They weren't victims anymore. They were operatives. Some were sent to other colonies, placed inside rival institutions, churches, militias, not to spy, to influence, to introduce new methods of reflection under the guise of religious awakening or pedagogical reform. These were not children anymore. They were seeds, planted, waiting to grow, waiting to reshape entire systems of power. Jonathan Prescott was one of them. But something went wrong, because even in his final entries, even after he had seemingly accepted the system, there were codes, fragments in the margins, warnings disguised as notes. A quiet resistance, one last breath of truth smuggled beneath the surface, and what he left behind would bring it all crashing down. Buried deep within the pages of Jonathan Prescott's journal was a cipher, something no one noticed for over a decade. It wasn't hidden in symbols or foreign alphabets. It was hidden in emotion. Every third paragraph, the first word was oddly chosen. Not incorrect, just off, too poetic, too alive. When Whitmore's investigators pieced the pattern together, they unearthed a parallel message running beneath the surface narrative. A message Jonathan never dared write directly, but one he designed to be found by someone like Whitmore. The message was simple, but devastating. They are building a map of the human soul, not to understand it, to erase it. Jonathan hadn't been broken. He had been pretending. He documented every phase of their transformation program, every method used to reverse moral direction, every chemical slipped into rations, every auditory tone used to evoke trauma-based obedience. And most damning of all, he revealed where the other programs were. There were 5, located across the colonies, all connected through a network of letters, sealed vaults, and family alliances, each specialized in a different type of control. New Haven, memory reconstruction; Providence, obedience reinforcement; Annapolis, moral reversal; Charleston, emotional extraction; and the worst, Philadelphia, the study of will erasure. These weren't schools. They were test chambers, and they shared their findings with London. You see, the experimental data wasn't just meant to maintain colonial control. It was being exported to the Crown. Britain had plans to implement these methods in Ireland, in India, in Africa, wherever uprisings threatened imperial stability. Jonathan had stumbled onto the real purpose of the Academy. It wasn't to control one generation. It was to write a blueprint for global obedience. He wrote, "They are building a future where rebellion is not punished, but prevented. Where the soul of man is rewritten to love his chains." And yet, despite all this knowledge, Jonathan died in silence, but not in vain, because the journal made it into the hands of Whitmore, and Whitmore made a choice the Crown never saw coming. He weaponized the truth. In the next section, we descend into the moment Whitmore turns from grieving father to revolutionary architect, using the enemy's own blueprints to build the beginning of their end. In the cold, oil-lit cellar beneath Whitmore's estate, maps of the colonies hung like war banners. Red wax marked each known facility. String-connected names, notes, handwritten, furious, sprawled across parchment. But this wasn't a merchant's study anymore. This was a war room. Whitmore wasn't grieving. He was becoming something else, something the Empire hadn't accounted for. A father with proof, power, and purpose. He didn't go to the press. He didn't run to Parliament. He went to the families. The other fathers, the mothers who'd buried empty coffins, the uncles who whispered at funerals. And he didn't bring comfort. He brought records. He showed them letters signed in the hands of men they'd once voted for. He showed receipts from Crown-funded shipments, devices, chemicals, blueprints. He laid out Jonathan's ciphered journal and let them read their own child's pain, mirrored word for word. Some broke. Some raged. All swore loyalty. Whitmore built a secret society, not of revolutionaries, not yet, but of remembrance. Men and women who would not forget. People who carried knowledge like gunpowder, waiting for the spark. And here's what shook the Empire to its bones. Whitmore didn't stop with families. He went to the clergy. He exposed how Philadelphia's will erasure program was built on corrupted theological texts, how ancient spiritual disciplines had been inverted, twisted, used to break faith rather than build it. He showed ministers how scripture had been weaponized. He flipped them. By spring of 1762, Whitmore's influence reached across 6 colonies, not as a rebel, but as a shadow broker of truth. When Josiah Fletcher was arrested, it wasn't for murder. It was for treason against the Crown. That wasn't a legal strategy. That was Whitmore's trap. By using the Empire's own language, he forced them to choose. They could protect the Fletchers and reveal the program's roots in London, or they could sacrifice the pawn to protect the king. They chose sacrifice. And that, right there, is when everything changed. Whitmore realized something chilling. The people at the top weren't villains. They were strategists. They didn't care who lived or died, only what worked. So Whitmore evolved. He stopped trying to punish. He started trying to replace. He would become what the Academy feared most, a man who'd seen the dark blueprint, memorized it, and begun building a counter-program, one designed not to control minds, but to awaken them. In the next section, we reveal the chilling rituals of Philadelphia's erasure chamber and why it nearly broke the will of an entire generation. They called it the Chamber of Light, a bitter irony. Deep beneath the seminary in Philadelphia, past false walls and iron doors disguised as wine cellars, lay a room built not for worship, but for obliteration. Not of the body, of the self. The chamber was designed after ancient rites once found in scrolls hidden beneath the Vatican, rituals meant to erase identity in prisoners of war. The architects of this place, funded by crown-aligned clergy, modernized those rituals with precision, secrecy, and cruelty that masqueraded as divinity. The ceiling glowed with mirrored gaslight, a light so white it removed all shadow, all contrast, all sense of space. Subjects were made to kneel on black salt floors, naked under that unrelenting light for hours, sometimes days. No clocks, no prayers, no food, just purity, they were told. But it wasn't purification, it was deconstruction. Clergy in pale robes recited mantras, contradictory, looping phrases that rewrote meaning mid-sentence. They whispered in Latin, English, Hebrew. The subject was forced to repeat the mantras until the words no longer made sense, until the voice no longer sounded like their own. The chamber had no corners, no echoes. It muted the world and the mind. They used isolation not to punish, but to disassemble. Identity became vapor. Memory became suggestion. Faith became obedience. And then they rebuilt the subject, word by word. They inserted new phrases into their mantras: loyalty, obedience, order. They implanted new sins, doubt, individuality, memory. Subjects emerged unable to speak their own name without permission. One child, Samuel Raines, came out of the chamber and didn't recognize his mother. Another, a girl named Eleanor, recited Bible verses backwards in her sleep for weeks until she collapsed from exhaustion. And that was the point. They weren't breaking people by accident. They were engineering silence. Philadelphia's erasure program was designed to test whether a person could be stripped of all autonomy and then turned into a willing, even grateful servant of institutional power. And it worked. Many subjects later served as guards, informants, even missionaries, spreading their hollow obedience like a virus. But one subject, just one, escaped, and he remembered everything. His journal, buried in the cornerstone of the seminary's eastern wing, would be recovered decades later. In it, he detailed the precise steps of identity erasure and the single phrase that helped him hold on to his sense of self. He carved it into the underside of the chapel pew in the dead of night, scratching until his fingers bled, until the word was etched deep enough to last beyond madness. Just one word: remember. The survivor, he never wrote his real name, only referred to himself as the one who walked out, recounted that single word as his anchor. He repeated it in his mind when the mantras tried to overwrite his thoughts, when they told him his past was a lie, when they told him he was reborn by their will. Remember, he whispered through clenched teeth as they poured salt water down his throat to purify him. Remember. When they played recordings of screams on a loop and told him it was the voice of his soul dying. Remember. When the light room stole the shadows from his eyes. This one syllable became a fortress, not a memory, a command. He documented in terrifying detail how each subject was stripped of the timeline of their life, First names were replaced with assigned roles: witness, servant, flame. Photographs of family were burned during ritual renunciations, and in their place, documents of falsified origin, baptismal records for a child who never existed, letters from a spiritual sponsor who had never been born. It was a method of total narrative replacement. And when that replacement succeeded, the subject's soul died. But when it failed, the results were explosive. The one who walked out described awakenings, violent ruptures in the mind when identity fought back. One boy tore the flesh from his own arms, searching for tattoos that had never existed. One girl screamed for 12 hours straight, not from pain, but from realization that she had once been someone else, someone whole. That's when the order would take them to the garden, not to heal them, to bury them. Underneath the seminary grounds lie over 40 unmarked graves. The church claimed it was a plague cemetery, but records show no disease, only silence. The journal was recovered by a maintenance worker during renovation in 1949. The worker later died under suspicious circumstances, his throat crushed, his larynx shattered as if silenced by unseen hands. But the journal survived. It now sits in a locked archive beneath the Library of Congress, misfiled under Religious Poetry Colonial Era, a mislabeling or a warning. We are now halfway down the spiral. If you hear this, type "I choose to remember" in the comments twice, not just for the algorithm, but because this is your anchor, this is your fortress, this is your word. Shall we open the next door? The door to the next chamber was not wood or steel. It was sound. They called it the frequency threshold. The deeper we dig into forbidden history, the more we find that power doesn't always arrive in the form of brute force or chains. Sometimes it comes as vibration, a quiet hum that splits the soul without spilling a drop of blood. The order discovered, centuries before modern science, that sound could be weaponized, not as noise, but as command. They didn't use drums or chants. They used harmonics, precise mathematical tones calibrated to stimulate specific emotional and physiological responses. One tone triggered overwhelming guilt, another, dissociation from time, and a third, described by a defector simply as the fall, induced complete surrender, the willing death of the self. Subjects who crossed the frequency threshold experienced time distortions. Witnesses say some walked out believing they'd been inside for a year. Others said only minutes passed, and a few never returned at all, left frozen in a catatonic trance. You don't need to believe this, but understand, the U.S. military believed it. In 1973, declassified documents from Project Montague confirmed that the Department of Defense had begun testing neurological entrainment via harmonic waveforms for crowd suppression and POW interrogation. The project lead? A man named Gerald Keats, whose grandfather was one of the last ordained ministers at the Order's hidden seminary. Coincidence? No. Inheritance. Power passes in blood and silence. Keats testified, privately, that these techniques were not invented by modern man. They were rediscovered, pulled from ancient texts buried beneath the Vatican and smuggled across the Atlantic by missionaries who were not there to save souls, but to perfect control. One line from his notes was underlined in red. The deepest prisons are not made of iron, they are sung into the mind. The journal from Section 18 had mentioned it too. A room where no words were spoken, only tones. A room that could bend the will of even the strongest. Ask yourself, why are certain frequencies restricted from broadcast? Why are binaural tones patented? Why did churches once forbid certain musical intervals, calling them diabolus in musica, the devil in music? Because they knew, and someone still does. They use your headphones, your screen time, your digital routines. Every notification, a note in the symphony. But if you've made it this far, you're beginning to hear something different. Not just the hum, but the pattern. Ready to break through the frequency wall? Then take my hand. There is a moment in every man's journey when the voices he's trusted begin to feel like echoes, engineered, rehearsed, repeated until belief becomes reflex. That moment is the threshold. And once crossed, there is no going back. Welcome to the room behind the sound. Beneath every modern intelligence agency lies a shadow lineage, practices older than any flag they serve. These aren't tools of investigation. They're instruments of possession. After World War II, as Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists into the heart of the American military machine, something darker slipped through. Die Glocke, the bell. Not a weapon in the conventional sense. A machine built to generate frequencies that dislocated time and mind. Witnesses claimed it distorted gravity, but survivors whispered of something worse. It rewrote memory. Subjects would forget who they were, what they believed, even who they loved. They called it the bell that rings backward. You're starting to see the thread now, aren't you? Ancient cults used chants and bowls. Priests used hymns and organs. Monarchs used choirs. And now, your screen pulses at 60 hertz. Your heartbeat follows. Your algorithms learn not just what you click, but how fast your pupils dilate. The next control system isn't a law, it's a loop, and the loop runs through you. You think this is paranoia? Tell me, why did the CIA fund MKUltra's Subproject 68, where patients were played loops of phrases like, "You are nothing without the state," over white noise and electroshock? Why did Temple University's 1985 psychological study find that ambient tones could change voting behavior? Why are sleep apps embedding subaudible affirmations you can't consciously hear? Because who you are is programmable. Unless you break the loop, unless you remember that sound is not just a medium, it's a ritual. The ancients said the world began with a word. What if the world is still being rewritten with every word you hear? This is the part they never wanted you to find, because it's not just history, it's happening. Right now. You are not hearing this by accident. You were meant to forget, but somehow you didn't. If you're ready to step through what comes next, if your blood is awake and your mind is locked in, comment the phrase, "The bell rings backward." Twice. Seal your awareness. Summon the others. Because the next descent will reveal what the bell was really guarding. And trust me, have you ever wondered why silence feels heavier in certain places? Not peaceful. Heavy. Like the walls are listening. Like the air is holding its breath. That silence is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of something unspeakable. We now enter the basement of history. When the bell rang backward in the Fletcher Academy, it wasn't just memory it erased. It was will. Students stopped resisting, not because they surrendered, but because they forgot they ever had a choice. And the experiments didn't stop in 1762. After the academy was demolished, its blueprints weren't lost. They were absorbed, folded into the design of certain behavioral correction centers in Pennsylvania, echoed in the construction of MKUltra safe houses in Montreal, repeated almost identically in black site interrogation rooms from Berlin to Baghdad. Always underground, always tiled for cleaning, always wired for sound. Why? Because the original purpose of those rooms wasn't punishment. It was redesign. They weren't breaking minds. They were remodeling souls. In 1949, a little-known document surfaced, quickly classified and buried. It described pattern threshold saturation, a process by which a subject could be psychologically shattered and rebuilt in just 72 hours using alternating frequencies and scripted trauma. The person who emerged afterward would have the same face, the same voice, but they would no longer ask why. They would only ask, what now? Now ask yourself, how many modern institutions echo that pattern? How many churches, classrooms, therapy centers, even apps are built around the cycle of breakdown, confession, reprogramming, and compliance? This isn't about Fletcher anymore. This is about you. Why is your attention always under siege? Why is every screen a pulpit, every ping a sermon, every app a confessional booth? Because silence no longer means peace. It means compliance. They have learned that true control is not enforced by fear or even by surveillance. It is enforced by ritual, repetition, and self-erasure. And if you've followed this far, if your pulse is steady and the bell is still ringing somewhere behind your eyes, then you already feel it. Something inside you was built in the image of freedom, and it's starting to remember its shape. The vault beneath the Academy wasn't on any official blueprint. Even Whitmore's investigators almost missed it. But behind a sealed limestone slab, disguised as a structural wall, they found it. A circular chamber lined with shelves, scrolls, and iron-bound volumes, meticulously preserved despite centuries of dust and silence. Inside were not just records, but manuals, psychological handbooks centuries ahead of their time, written in precise clinical handwriting. Each volume began the same way: to shape the mind, unmake the soul. These weren't the works of accidental cruelty. They were blueprints for perfect obedience. Each manual was numbered, labeled by the subject's classification: initiate, disbeliever, revolutionary, heir. One book stood out, a thick, red leather tome called Threshold Doctrine. It didn't describe pain. It described reinvention. How to strip identity down to its scaffolding and rebuild it with implanted doctrine. It referenced ancient texts, Babylonian trial chambers, Mithraic underground temples, even certain lost Jewish sects that experimented with dream fasting. And then came the drawings, diagrams of chairs built to restrict not just motion but breath rhythm, helmets that emitted low-frequency pulses in patterns proven to induce disassociation, eye slits painted with biblical verses designed to distort time perception. One blueprint eerily resembled early versions of sensory deprivation tanks, long before they were invented in the 1950s. Every detail engineered not to destroy, but to rescript. The final page of Threshold Doctrine wasn't written by its original author. It was added later, dated 1913. The handwriting was looser, but the message was unmistakable. Tested at Bellevue. 3 subjects. Memory fragmentation successful. Preparing transmission to Vienna. Further tests advised before institutional integration. Vienna, as in Freud, as in Jung. It wasn't just torture passed forward, it was methodology. You begin to realize what began beneath a Colonial Academy didn't die there. It grew, it evolved, it was carried, not in whispers, but in research, in clinics, in governments, in the architecture of control that surrounds us now. The question is no longer, did they do it? The question is, where else did they do it? Comment this phrase twice to lock in the transformation. I see the pattern. I won't forget the silence. I see the pattern. I won't forget the silence. I'll know his name. You've heard it your entire life, surrounded by prestige and accomplishment. A founder, a thinker, a father of systems. But what if I told you he wasn't the beginning? He was the continuation. Buried in the records from the Fletcher Academy vault was a single slip of parchment, faded, brittle, but still legible. At the bottom, a signature, B. Franklin. Above it, only 3 words, Threshold Adaptation Approved. Benjamin Franklin, America's lightning tamer, diplomat, philosopher, but also a man obsessed with control, secrecy, and psychological influence. In private correspondence, never released to public archives, Franklin wrote of educational conditioning chambers and the necessity of artificial conviction in shaping the common citizen. He praised the Academy's willingness to do what polite society could not. He wasn't alone. Hidden in code within the minutes of certain founding conventions are references to Project Isaiah, the Concord Protocol, and Silas's draft, names that meant nothing at the time, but which appear repeatedly in letters between early American elites and British intelligence officers. These weren't just political architects. They were behavioral engineers. You're not taught this version of history. You're taught that minds were shaped by books, by speeches, by ideas. But the truth is darker. Minds were shaped by fear, by deprivation, by mirrors placed in front of children until they believed they were monsters unless they obeyed. Franklin and his circle understood something most leaders feared to admit. Freedom without obedience leads to collapse. So instead, they buried obedience in ritual. Think about it. Why do our institutions resemble temples? Why do our schools, courtrooms, and even Capitol buildings follow the same architecture? Columns, domes, central altars? It's not by accident. It's by inheritance. The Fletcher Academy was not a mistake in the system. It was the system, the prototype, the lab, the original forge. Everything from the bell schedule of your childhood school to the tone of authority in a police officer's voice was refined there, standardized, packaged for scale. So the next time you feel that quiet hesitation when confronted by an institution, know this, that fear was designed, that obedience was crafted, and the men who made it have monuments in every American city. We're not done yet. They didn't bury the Fletcher Academy's knowledge. They repurposed it. After the Academy's collapse in 1762, you'd expect the techniques to vanish into ash, locked away, forgotten. But what really happened was far more calculated. The records, experiments, even the architectural blueprints were transferred, not to historians, but to government planners and private societies. By 1802, an underground group formed in Boston, calling themselves the Methodists of Structure. Not a religious sect, not truly. Their charter, hidden in the annals of the Massachusetts Historical Society, speaks of the maintenance of civic cohesion through behavioral alignment. Their first action? Advising on the design of prisons. The panopticon, a prison structure where inmates feel watched at all times, was never just about containment. It was a psychological tool, a direct descendant of the Academy's reflection chambers. They took a concept born in torture and applied it to cities. Look at our cities now. Traffic cameras, ID checkpoints, security lines. For your safety, they say. But safety is just the modern name for obedience. The same hands that wired pain into children's minds at the Academy are the ancestors of those who crafted public school policies, military boot camp routines, corporate training programs, and law enforcement interrogation methods. Every system designed to make you second-guess your instinct is born from that same root. Still think this is just history? In 1963, a document surfaced during a congressional hearing on human experimentation. It referred cryptically to a Massachusetts model for behavior modification, citing experiments preceding the founding of the Republic. It was dismissed, filed away, and classified under national security exemption. But it didn't vanish. One of the hearing's observers, a young CIA recruit named Gordon Liddy, Anno, an education reformer named William Bennett. They saw the template and carried it forward. So when you sit in a boardroom with strange lighting, low chairs, and controlled temperature, remember, they learned those techniques from rooms designed to break boys into silence. You are not the first subject. You are simply the modern version. And now that you know this, you cannot unknow it. This is the descent, and we're only now reaching the part where the machine starts to speak. When they burned down the Fletcher Academy in 1762, it wasn't to erase it. It was to transform it. They didn't destroy the structure. They scattered its DNA. The physical building vanished, yes, but the ideas, the blueprints, the protocols, those were harvested, refined, and embedded into the next generation of institutions. And what emerged? 3 pillars: education, medicine, governance. Let's start with education. In 1789, Harvard quietly received an anonymous endowment from a group calling themselves the Society for Cognitive Uniformity. This money was used to fund the construction of Harvard Hall Annex B, later renamed the Behavioral Sciences Wing. The curriculum? Experimental pedagogy, conditioning students through lighting, sound, posture control, not to teach them what to think, but how. Lesson plans were never about content. They were about timing, discipline, and reward cycles. Why do you think bells ring between classes? Why are you taught to raise your hand before speaking? Why is punishment always delivered just after a moment of clarity? That's classical conditioning, Fletcher style. Now, medicine. The so-called rest cure of the 19th century, where women were confined to beds, stripped of stimulation, and gaslit into submission, was not a medical discovery. It was a direct adaptation of the Academy's isolation chambers, modified, rebranded, sanitized, but just as brutal. And it worked. It taught obedience through dependency. It turned treatment into indoctrination. Finally, governance. In 1833, a secret task force formed under Andrew Jackson's administration to study psychological pacification of the frontier. Among its members, a descendant of Samuel Fletcher. Their conclusion was chilling. The control of perception is more effective than the control of action. That doctrine became the basis for domestic policy models, war propaganda, IRIS, and eventually the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA. Today, every time a public figure falters and then returns with a teary apology, every time a new normal is introduced with gentle language and flashing colors, every time your instincts scream something's wrong, but the world around you insists everything's fine. That's not coincidence. That's the echo of a basement chamber, designed in Colonial Massachusetts, refined over centuries, now governing reality itself. You were never free. You were managed. You've heard the name MK Ultra whispered in documentaries and podcasts, haven't you? Described as a Cold War paranoia project, CIA experiments, LSD on unsuspecting citizens. But they never tell you where those ideas truly came from. Because MK Ultra wasn't born in the 1950s. It was resurrected. Its spiritual ancestor? The Fletcher Academy. The basement chambers. The behavioral ledgers. The mapping of human thresholds. Pain, fear, identity collapse. Fletcher didn't just experiment on children. He created predictive models of how the human mind fractures and how to rebuild it into something obedient. Sound familiar? In 1947, Project Chatter began under Navy intelligence. Its aim? To determine how extreme psychological stress could control high-value prisoners. But the documents, recently declassified, refer to an earlier file, codename Project Echo. That file contained photocopied pages from Jonathan Prescott's journal. That's how deep the rot goes. They used his notes, his trauma, as a prototype. The tactics were updated, LSD instead of starvation, hypnosis instead of beatings. But the goal remained. Control identity at the core, break it, reform it, use it. And now, look around. You think surveillance is just cameras on street corners? Think again. Today's methods don't monitor your actions. They monitor your choices, your feed, your clicks, your pauses between swipes. That's modern behavioral mapping. They no longer need to beat you or drug you. They just show you your own reflection, one algorithmically adjusted image at a time, until you adopt the identity they wrote for you. They call it customization, but it's digital Fletcherism. Even now, your brain is being trained. Every advertisement, every suggested video, every gentle tone from your device saying, "Here's what you want next." You don't choose, you are chosen. And the elite? They know exactly which trigger to pull and when. It's not about privacy anymore. It's about predictability. If they can predict your next 5 moves, they own you. Your rebellion is not unseen. It is anticipated. And the worst part, you agreed to all of it. Every I accept, every fingerprint login, every casual glance at a screen. They watched Fletcher break minds in candlelit basements. Now they do it in daylight, with Wi-Fi and touchscreens. The horror of the Fletcher Academy didn't die in 1762. It mutated, it disguised itself, and it passed through blood. Because while the colonial government sealed the files, the Fletcher family sealed something else, their legacy. You see, Josiah Fletcher had a brother. His name rarely appears in records. A man who changed his surname before fleeing the colonies. He settled quietly in the Hudson River Valley, took up banking, and raised a son. That son, he would become one of the first directors of a private asylum in the new American Republic. And guess what? The asylum's charter included a clause authorizing experimental moral treatment, a phrase lifted word for word from Josiah's journals. 3 generations later, the Fletcher name vanished completely. But the methods, they didn't. They reappeared in the minds of men with influence, advisors to presidents, founders of elite prep schools, architects of juvenile detention centers, and always behind the curtain. Meticulous records, psychological charts, behavioral flow diagrams, the ghost handwriting of the Fletcher method. In 1952, a quiet man named Robert C.F., a direct descendant, became a key figure in the newly formed Department of Behavioral Sciences at a major U.S. university. One of his first papers, a treatise on the efficacy of sensory deprivation in identity restructuring. He even footnoted Prescott J. 1761. Most scholars dismissed it as a typographical error. But we know better now. Robert's research was cited by the early architects of MK Ultra, and later by designers of interrogation protocols at Guantanamo Bay. This isn't genealogy. This is institutional inheritance, a lineage of silence, of sanitized brutality wrapped in academic prestige. The Fletcher doctrine survived, not in name, but in application. And here's where the bloodline comes home. In 2003, a new security bill was quietly passed in Congress. Buried in the language was funding for youth behavior calibration centers. The sponsor of that clause? Senator William J. Fletcher, descendant of Robert. His grandfather's original surname? Whitmore. That's right. The family lines of victim and oppressor have long since merged. The blood of the tortured now fuels the tools of the torturer. This isn't just history repeating. This is design fulfilling itself. They called it the Deep Room. No diagrams of it were ever included in the Academy's official blueprints. No journals described its function. And yet, every investigator who stood over the flattened earth where the building once stood felt it. Below the chapel, beneath the main dormitory, deeper even than the reflection chambers, there existed a sub-basement, a room carved not by hands trained in masonry, but by something older, cruder, more deliberate. It was Thomas Blackwood, during the final phase of Whitmore's investigation, who unearthed the first piece of evidence, a child's brass ring, blackened, bent, found in a hollowed stone beneath where the northern wall of the academy once stood. When they dug further, they discovered a chamber, perfectly circular, the stone walls smooth, almost fused. No tool marks, no torch burns, no seams, just one room, one doorway, and symbols, carved deep into the stone, running floor to ceiling, in a pattern too precise to be coincidence, too non-human to be cultural. There were no words, just a sequence of lines and curves that triggered immediate physiological responses in those who looked too long. Investigators reported migraines, nausea, memory lapses. 2 refused to return after the first day, whispering about echoes that don't belong to time. The room's air was wrong, heavier, colder, not in temperature, in intent. And at the very center was a chair, not constructed, grown. Out of the floor itself, like the chamber had been waiting for centuries to be used. This is where they tested their final subjects. Not for obedience, not even for psychological resilience, but for something else. Those few recovered records referenced Phase 5, identity transfer, a procedure that doesn't appear in any medical or scientific context of the time. But the journals describe it plainly, the attempt to extract identity and rape it, lace it. The deep room was not meant to break a student. It was meant to empty them. And whatever was done in that chair, it didn't stay there. Because years later, when a psychiatric hospital in upstate New York was razed in 1914, they found an identical room in its foundation. Same symbols, same chair, same smell of cold stone and iron. There are symbols that decorate, symbols that guide, and then there are symbols that command. The carvings found in the deep room of the Fletcher Academy were not the first of their kind, nor were they the last. They have been traced, quietly, by a handful of researchers willing to risk academic ruin, to burial sites in Cappadocia, to the catacombs beneath Paris, and to pre-Columbian temples that predate official timelines of human migration. But what makes them truly dangerous is not where they appear, it's what they do. A linguist named Ellis Harrow, dismissed from Oxford in 1907 for claims deemed esoterically unstable, proposed a chilling theory. These are primordial operating codes, not for machines, but for minds. He called them cognitive sigils. Geometric instructions that, when seen by the human eye and processed by the visual cortex, bypass rational thought and embed themselves into the subconscious. Not suggestively, irrevocably. They don't just influence behavior, they alter the architecture of belief. And what was the goal of Phase 5 at the Academy? To remove identity and replace it. It wasn't metaphor, it wasn't philosophy, it was code. The same sigils later appeared in Cold War black site documents, scratched into the walls of CIA memory reconsolidation chambers in Berlin and Camp King. Declassified memos refer to Test Pattern 6C, Preset Empathy Disruption, and Pattern 11X, the collapse sequence. Harrow died in an institution after carving those same symbols into his skin, reportedly screaming that the instruction has begun. We believe the Fletchers didn't create the deep room, they found it, and what they discovered wasn't just a method of control, it was a technology, not mechanical, not digital, but mnemonic, psychospatial, an operating system for the human soul. And just as we install new software over outdated code, they Arnade how to install new selves over the people they erased. Remember that phrase from earlier? Type it twice in the comments now. They cannot unsee me. Once for the man you were, once for the one who awakens. Because from here on, this is no longer history. They told you war changed after 1945, that torture was outlawed, that psychological manipulation was the concern of villains in movies, not real governments. But the truth? What the Fletchers built in their basement became a blueprint. After World War II, as intelligence agencies scrambled for superiority, they didn't start from scratch. They mined history, hidden, buried history. And at the center of it all was something called Project Deep Echo. Officially declassified in fragments in the late 1990s, Deep Echo was a multi-agency collaboration between the CIA, the British Psychological Warfare Division, and private contractors whose names have since been erased from every database. What was their goal? To replicate the Fletcher effect, permanent identity disassembly and reconstruction, without the need for crude confinement. They wanted to do it remotely, in classrooms, in training centers, in movie theaters, and eventually, through screens. Documents recovered from a 1972 Senate subcommittee hearing buried under unrelated budget allocations described the desired outcome, a modular protocol for ideological destabilization and re-imprinting, capable of being delivered via sensory media in less than 9 cumulative hours. In plain terms, they wanted to break and rebuild the human mind in a weekend. They studied old manuscripts, occult texts, even Native American shamanic rites. But most disturbingly, they studied the Fletcher records. One Deep Echo file references a technique called resonant compartmentalization, based on Martha Fletcher's original sensory deprivation notes. They recreated her experiments, only this time using sound waves and flickering light. Now listen closely. What happens when you combine ancient cognitive sigils, high-frequency audio pulses, and controlled exposure to fear-based narrative structures? You create an experience that, bypasses the rational filter. The same feeling you get when a song gives you goosebumps, when a film makes you cry against your will, when a piece of art haunts you even if you don't understand why. It's not just entertainment, it's training. And the most effective programs, you ask to see them. You pay to participate. You call it content. They call it compliance. You ever wonder why certain videos leave you feeling hollow? Why some news stories ignite rage, despair, or tribal loyalty in seconds before you've even thought? It's not random. It's not even organic. Welcome to the age of algorithmic obedience. What began as a system of torture in the Fletcher basements now lives inside every scroll, every swipe, every feed refresh. But it's refined, digitized, turned from iron chains into neural ones. We call it content. They call it emotive conditioning. It starts with engineered exposure. You see a headline that confirms your fear, then another that triggers disgust, then a meme that disarms you with humor. Your limbic system is hijacked before your prefrontal cortex even gets a chance to analyze. This is no accident. Behind the curtain of every major platform sits a machine, a system trained on billions of data points. It knows how long you look at a face. It knows which word combinations spark urgency in your blood. It knows what kind of truth you're willing to reject and which lie you'll defend to your grave. And it uses that, not to sell you shoes, but to bend your worldview. Now listen closely, because this is where the old meets the new. A 2013 leak from an unnamed NATO psychological warfare contractor confirmed the existence of echo protocols, digital descendants of the Deep Echo program. These were designed not to inform, but to instill learned helplessness, to overwhelm the subject with emotional contradiction, show hope, then despair. Unity, then betrayal. This imbalance destabilizes identity, and once you're destabilized, you're easy to rescript. Just like the students in the Fletcher Academy, only now the walls are invisible, and the torture is agreeable. Scroll, click, react, repeat. You're being trained, just like they were, to obey a system you cannot see and defend beliefs you did not choose. Still, think your anger is yours? Still think your opinions were earned? Or could it be that you're living inside a new kind of academy? One without gates, without guards, where compliance feels like freedom. You've heard their names, Zuckerberg, Musk, Pichai, Altman, but these are not the architects. They are the faces, the PR layer, the interface between you and something far older, far colder. The real architects are the quiet ones, the behavioral scientists tucked into think tanks with no websites, the neural coders under contract by DARPA-linked firms, the legacy psychologists whose bloodlines trace back to institutions like Tavistock, MK Ultra, and yes, even Fletcher Academy. They have no need for chains or whips. Their tools are cleaner now, feedback loops, dopamine drops, and predictive behavior models. And it all runs on something you gave freely, your attention. Here's how it works. Every scroll, every tap, every hesitation is data. And from that data, they draw maps of your mind, emotional terrain models more accurate than any diary or therapist could create. They know where your rage lives. They know what makes you feel powerful. They know which stories make you kneel. And with that knowledge, they program you. It begins with priming. Feed you certain imagery at just the right moment in your sleep cycle. Inject subtle emotional triggers through curated content loops. Shape your values, not with force, but with familiarity. What you see most becomes what you believe. Then comes the split, manufacturing internal conflict. Make you feel empowered one day and powerless the next. Give you a cause, then turn it on its head. Confusion creates dependency. Now you come back for clarity, for belonging, for identity, and they provide it, for a price. But here's the twist most never see. You are not just the subject. You become the agent. Once your behavior aligns with the system's rhythm, once your content, your reactions, your conversations begin echoing their tone, you spread the programming. You enforce the conditioning. You become Fletcher without knowing. It ever seen someone destroyed for questioning a trend? Ever felt the urge to silence, mock, or cancel someone who stepped outside the narrative? That wasn't you. That was the system, moving through you. This is how they win, not through domination, but through replication. You internalize the academy, and then you become it. Beneath the cracked floorboards of a long-demolished academy in Essex County, Massachusetts, there's a map, not of roads or territories, but of control systems, etched into hidden ledgers, carved into wood with trembling hands, inked in blood and silence. It was never just a school. The Covenant Academy was the prototype, a prototype of an invisible empire. Its walls didn't just train students, they created models, behavioral archetypes, obedient citizens, hollow revolutionaries, silent enforcers. And these models were exported to seminaries in Connecticut, to military outposts in Virginia, to financial guilds in New York, a network rooted not in location, but in ritual, psychological ritual. You see, the real weapon wasn't torture, it was structure. A system of breaking and rebuilding, first through isolation, then confusion, then dependency, then identity replacement. The goal wasn't pain, it was transformation, total, permanent. Fletcher didn't invent this, he refined it. Its origins stretch back to ancient temples, where priest-kings used sound, symbols, and starvation to fracture the minds of initiates, to mold men into tools, useful, loyal, lost. Every empire since has used a version of it. Rome with its gladiator schools, the British with their public boarding regimes, the Soviets with their re-education camps, and America with its prisons masked as schools, its churches turned laboratories, its apps turned altars. The Academy's legacy didn't die in 1762. It evolved. It moved online, into systems of digital initiation, where young minds are fed rituals of shame, validation, betrayal, and reward. The algorithm is now the headmaster, and the basement is your pocket. You were told this was progress, that data-driven feedback would free you, that optimized behavior would unlock potential. But look closer. Are you freer, or just more responsive? More aligned with a system that rewards compliance, that punishes dissent, that whispers unity while breeding uniformity. The Covenant Academy lives on, not in buildings, but in behavior, in ideology, in infrastructure. You walk through its corridors every day and don't even see the walls. But you do feel them, the pressure, the guilt, the endless testing, the fear of wrong speech, wrong thought, wrong belief. That's not freedom. That's curriculum. If you've made it here, you're not the same man who pressed play. The descent changes you, as it should. So now I ask you, comment below, twice, the phrase, "I was never meant to be theirs." Let them know someone woke up. Let the algorithm register your fracture. And if you feel something rising in you now, let it grow. There's no diploma for this school, but there is a way out. You've just taken the first step.